Welcome to the Money to the Masses podcast, putting you in control of your finances. One mic, two idiots, and, according to our latest figures, 3 listeners. Here are your hosts, Damien Fay and Andy Leaks.
Before we start, Andy, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsors, Money Farm. Now, Money Farm are the largest digital wealth manager in Europe, and they create portfolios of ETFs for their clients. They're incredibly cheap and ideal for somebody who's wanting to get into investing, and perhaps for more experienced investors who don't actually want to run their own money anymore. Now, they will even offer to run the first £20,000 of any of our listeners' portfolio absolutely free if they enter the code MTTM20K into the website at moneyfarm.com. For more information, check out their website. But for now, Andy, let's get back on with the show.
Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm good, Andy. I'm really good. I'm in the middle of sort of rushing between sports day of the most bizarre things I could be doing, but it's sports day at my eldest daughter's school, and they've just had a first round almost of sporting and sprints and stuff, and then we go back a little bit later for a bit more. So I've kind of nipped home doing a podcast and actually rejoicing at the fact that the dad's race was cancelled. So a big punch in the air. My hamstrings are happy. I don't mind laughing at my old story of tearing my hamstrings. I know what it's like. But mums and dad races are always a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, but you'd have been well placed this year to do quite well, because you're back in the gym and getting fit and healthy. So you may have well placed in the top 3.
Well, I'm back in there, Andy. In the gym. I'm only for the last couple of weeks. After years of not doing anything, I've been spurred to go back to the gym and try and get a bit fitter, which I'm actually really enjoying. One of the funny things is our bodies are terrible, aren't they? If you do more exercise, you start feeling better and have more energy, ironically. But if you do less, the opposite happens. So it would be nice if our bodies actually worked with us on that one, because the less exercise you do, the less inclined you are to do any, because you sort of just get more and more lethargic. But you have to feel knackered to actually start feeling generally more awake, which seems, in my mind, a little back to front. You rest up and you don't feel any better, but if you do exercise, you do. So, I'm back in the gym, but I'm glad the dad's race isn't on. I mean, last year, I didn't do the dad's race, obviously, but every year I've ever seen a mum or dad's race at the school, there's normally an incident, and you end up having to try and not laugh. And I remember last year, I shouldn't laugh, the lady was okay, but they did a mum's race, and the mums are more competitive than dads sometimes. They were sprinting, they were going along, and they got towards the end, and there was one lady who was obviously trying to beat her friend and thought she was going to win, and really, really went for it, and dipped for the line, but she made 2 mistakes. She over-dipped, and she wasn't at the line, so she face planted at such a pace into the floor in front of the entire school, and ended up coming last and limping over the line. She was okay afterwards, hence why I'm laughing. But it was one of those moments where you had to sort of bite your hand and not laugh, because you would have appeared to be insensitive. But yeah, I've been there, so I can. I don't mind laughing at someone else's misfortune. People have laughed at mine, but yeah, it was none of that this year.
Good stuff. So what have we got on the pod this week? What's happening?
Right, this week, Andy, I've got 3 pieces. I've been doing a lot of work on costs and investing. Now, it's something I've come back to a bit on 80/20 Investor, because there was some interesting anomalies that have been pulled out about whether, in the past when I've touched upon the subject, about whether you should just always go for the cheapest funds, or whether there's ever a case of being warranted to pay a bit more for a fund, because every fund has an annual charge, right? So do you go down to the bottom end where the ETFs are, and will you always do better because if you go down there, or can you go up towards a sort of more expensive active manager fund? So I did a load of research into that this week, and 80/20 Investor members will reap the benefits of that. And actually, I pull out some key numbers, so what sort of charge you should be aiming for to optimise the return over time. So I compared past returns with annual charges to see if there's a correlation, and there is a pattern. So I'm not going to give that away, because obviously that's for 80/20 Investor members. But what I am going to do, I want to draw a real life analogy. You know my love of analogies to try and explain financial matters, and I'm going to use my experience a week ago with an Uber taxi to explain about why going cheap on funds and fund management charges isn't always the best thing. Because it would seem logically that surely always cutting costs is going to be better. I also want to talk about something to do with pensions and people who want to cash in their pensions, and there's a major tax implication that people are overlooking. That's a short-term one, but if you're thinking about cashing in your pension for house improvements or giving your kids a helping hand on the housing ladder, then you'll want to listen to this. Or if in fact you are one of those children, you're thinking of convincing your dad or mum to give you a chunk of their pension. And another piece I want to do is it's related to Brexit inadvertently, but it's about the fall of the pound. Now, at the moment, the pound has fallen massively against the dollar and most other currencies in the world as a result of Brexit vote, because obviously when we voted to leave, everybody thought our economy will slump and blah blah blah, and it ends up meaning that people sell our currency, because as just a very simple measure, currencies are quite a good quasi-indicator of what people think about the strength of an economy. So it's had impacts if you're going to buy things abroad, and one of the interesting ones are people who want to have weddings abroad, and someone has done some research into the impact of the fall in the pound on you getting married in various locations around the world. So I'm going to share that with you, and also how you can mitigate the rising costs, because inevitably the cost has gone up quite a bit. So that's another one I'm going to cover.
Great. What are we going to start with?
What do you reckon? Should we do the Uber one? Right, one of the reasons I want to do this one, actually, because it leads quite nicely to tell people I won't be doing a podcast next week, or we won't be, Andy, because I'm actually having a rare break. I'm going away for a period, and I don't mind mentioning this because I never would mention if I was going away, because I'd fear that someone might come and burgle my house. But actually, my better half, it's a special birthday for her, so we're going away for a couple of days, and my parents are coming and staying in my house with the kids, so there's somebody going to be here. But the point is that the reason that I also mention it is because last week, as part of the going out for to celebrate this birthday, we actually had a meal with a group of friends. Okay, so we went up to central London and we caught the train in, and we went to, you'll know it, Andy, because you know the area, but in central London, if you get into Cannon Street, okay, which is the train station us and a couple of friends got into, and we came outside, and obviously it was a boiling hot day. It was the middle of the afternoon, and it was something like 30 degrees, and everyone's sweating in their nice clothes and everything. So understandably, the place we wanted to go to was probably, I would have walked it personally. It would have been about a sort of a 20-minute walk, 15-minute walk, Andy. It was not far from actually near where you work.
Funnily enough, Damien, I go into Cannon Street every time when I go into London, and I do that walk, so I know exactly the walk.
Yeah, so
so it's not too far, but it can be sweaty on a hot day.
Yeah, in a hot day it is a bit much, and I understandably we said, oh well, do you know what? For the group generally didn't want to walk, and especially I totally get that my better half didn't particularly want to be walking in. I haven't got ready to go out and then turn up looking completely bedraggled and hot and sweaty. So I said, oh, we'll get a taxi, right? Now, while I was going to get this taxi, we decided you're in central London, you can get a black cab, okay, or the powers of Uber. And I've been slowly enjoying Uber over the last sort of 6 months. I've started using Uber, and everyone knows what Uber is. You open your app, it finds you based on your location of your phone. A taxi turns up when you've said where you want to go, and you jump in, jump out the other end. It's all paid via PayPal, and it's obviously very efficient for the people who use it. Now, one of the things about Uber is that Uber, people might not realise, is heavily subsidised in terms of the fare. So our fares via Uber is effectively massively subsidising the cost of your taxi fare to make the app and the whole business take over the world. Because if they were charging a normal rate, then obviously it probably wouldn't compete with taxis. So we're really getting cheap taxi rides. That's what happens. And that's why black cabs don't like it. So what I want to do is tell my experience of using this Uber and compare it to fund management and whether you invest in cheap or expensive funds. Because at the same time that I stood there and decided we're going to go with Uber, that was the consensus. So I pressed the app to go with Uber. At the same time, my brother, who was on another train, he was going to arrive about 10-15 minutes after me at the same station. And he said to me, I'll just jump in a cab when I get at the other end and meet you there. Now, Justin, his name is actually, decided that he was just going to jump into one of the black cabs that was outside. And that's just coincidence. Now, obviously you can see where this analogy is probably going. Justin went for the traditional, more expensive taxi driver who's got the knowledge, and I went for the cheap, modern, efficient, apparently, Uber. And obviously Uber drivers follow a sat-nav, which is based purely on an algorithm that takes them supposedly trying to avoid the shortest route, but hopefully take into account traffic. Of course, you've got the expensive black cabbie who knows the roads like the back of his hand. Now, what I didn't mention is actually on this day was effectively Mardi Gras in London, so the place was mental, it was packed. And I hadn't quite realised that when I came out of Cannon Street, because that area around there was quite quiet. So I fired up Uber. So in the investment world, what I did there was I'll go with my investment tracker, okay, the really cheap ETF that costs you almost nothing, because it's run by a computer. So I pressed on the app, and I'm watching this taxi driver, and I can see he's only about a street away, and I'm thinking, this is awesome. My wife says to me, oh, are they nearby? Oh yeah, he's just up the road there. I then proceeded to watch this chap go round and round in circles and go further away from us as he missed turnings, and his sat-nav was directing him all over the place. About 10 minutes later, I was still waiting for this Uber driver to arrive. And cut long story short, he eventually did. We then jumped into the taxi, really nice guy, and he's going, oh, I see where you're going, we'll go to the restaurant. We started heading up the road, and then we just hit a gridlock. And if you know, Andy, near Liverpool Street, that way, around London. Now, normally in central London, it isn't particularly busy at that time of day, that part of London, but it was hectic with lots of tourists and the traffic. So we sat in this taxi. I lost track of time in the end, and in the end we got to the restaurant, and it was more expensive than it would need to be, because obviously it took us such a long time to get there. And we got at the other end and sort of feel hot and bothered anyway. It got into the restaurant, only to be greeted by my brother and his wife already sitting at the table drinking drinks. And I said, how the hell did you get here before me? And he said, I jumped in a black cab. So the moral of this story, where this is all going, is that it just struck me as a good analogy as to about investing. Now, at the moment, there's a massive drive in the national press banging on about buying passive investments, and passive investments are the ones that are run by computers because they're incredibly cheap, and over the long run they will outperform because you pay hardly anything in charges, blah blah blah. Computers will rule the world. And of course you've got the other end, which are the active managers, who are saying what we do is so fantastic we can outperform. The truth is they never do, not over the long term. But what they do is all funds, whether active or passive, every dog has its days, I keep trying to remind people. And so there'll be periods where they do outperform. So in this case, using that analogy of the taxis, the best choice that my brother actually made was he went with the most expensive option initially, it would appear, by going with a taxi. But what the taxi driver did is, because he's a local cabbie with the knowledge, he was ducking and diving down back roads and got there in minutes, because he knew what was going to happen. Despite what the sat-navs tell you and the computers were working it out, he knew the quick way to go. So he was far more efficient, and he got them there. And it actually ended up being cheaper than what I paid in the long run, and he got there quicker. And so me trying to be clever and using a very algorithmic-based method, it actually ended up costing me. Now, taking that analogy further, if you were going to go from here to Scotland, you would never take a black cab because you have to remortgage your house to do it. I mean, you might not want to take an Uber, but it end up being cheaper because those macro conditions, like what you call pride, that was kind of an event that was going on in the sort of macro world that the algorithms of Uber didn't quite take into account. But the fund manager, that would be the equivalent of the black cabbie, was able to, based on past experience. Now, he wouldn't get it right all the time, but the moral of the story is, in small windows of opportunity, in this case a very short distance, in fund management a very small time window of say 3-6 months, actually costs become very irrelevant in predicting who will do the best. The cheapest definitely isn't always the best, and in fact you need to base it on a lot more factors than just cost if you pick a fund. If you keep reviewing your situation, which I'm banging on about to people, if you constantly review your portfolio, then the overall cost of it actually becomes slightly less important. Now, if you buy and hold for the long term, absolutely you want to go with the cheapest, or as cheap as you can. Costs matter, not necessarily the cheapest, because if you get a tracker, you'll just match the market. What happens is you get a better spread if you get active managers, because some of them will massively outperform, but actually more of them start to underperform if you buy and hold for the long term. So with the analogy that we're talking about here, sometimes if you're going to keep reviewing, the most important thing to do is review your portfolio. So you're only ever in a fund for a relatively limited period of time. Rather than years, you might be in it for 6 months at a time, or maybe up to a year, but don't leave it for 10 years. But if you keep reviewing, then the cost that fund charges becomes less important, because they actually have an opportunity and a greater chance of outperforming if you don't just limit your options to the cheapest. If you limit your options to just the cheapest, then you are only ever going to match what the market does. And so for me, it was just a good example of a real world why algorithms won't always work in a very limited short time frame, because they don't take account of that macro environment. And in the fund world, that could be because the central banks start ramping up interest rates, or it could be something the oil price falls or something like that. And that's where fund managers can outperform in the short term. Don't, by all means, you wouldn't get a taxi to Scotland, you wouldn't stay in an active fund for your entire life, because in the long run they'll probably underperform but move around. So there you go, that's my analogy of Uber. Just think, if you want to know why you shouldn't always go cheapest, then think of Uber. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insight, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers in the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, so we're talking about weddings, overseas weddings, the value of the pound. What have you got?
Yeah, we've got, what happened is a piece of research this week by, I'll name check them actually, Hargreaves Lansdown did it. I don't know why they did it actually, but they did a piece of research that talked about the cost of weddings, overseas weddings, and how they have jumped in price as a result of the Brexit vote. Now, I suppose it's an inevitability, to be honest. You could change the word wedding and put anything, house, or any large purchase overseas, but it's quite a nice story, because I know there seems to be an increasing trend of people getting married abroad, and it makes people, well, they might want to bear in mind the cost of what that will be going forwards. And there are also other issues which I'll come on to. With the cost of a wedding going up, you've got to actually, the movements in our currency are going to start impacting your payments for your wedding over time, so you might want to do something to mitigate that, but I'll come on to that. So what did the research show? I mean, what they did is they looked at, if you took £10,000 this time, well, last year, just before the Brexit vote, and how much currency that would buy you in various different places that are popular with weddings, how much more you'd have to spend to buy the same equivalent amount of foreign currency. So I'm going to rattle through them, and this is kind of a list from the worst hit place to the one that is probably least. But if you were planning on getting married in South Africa, then your £10,000 would actually, you're going to end up having to spend about £12,500 now to get the same wedding. So basically it's gone up £2,500. So that's a 25% basically increase in the cost of the wedding. If you want to get married in India, then the fall of the pound versus the Indian rupee has caused that £10,000 that would have been buying you a chunk of your wedding. You're going to have to now use £12,000. If you want to get married in Thailand, that's gone up a little bit less than that. I mean, these are very exotic places that people are getting married, but understand people have families and stuff over there that they will get married. I'm just jealous because I didn't get married abroad. Thailand, Actually, you have to say though, I did go to a wedding. I was the best man at a wedding that was abroad, and it's one of those awkward ones where you almost got to the point where I couldn't really afford to go. And what made it even more awkward, it was my twin brother, and I did almost have a conversation with saying that I want to go, but I can't really afford to go. And it was an awkward conversation, and it's one of those moral dilemmas that you could put out there to people and say, what should you do? And in the end, I just had to suck it up, basically, and spend a hell of a lot of money going to Mexico for a wedding, which, I mean, you do these things. But do bear in mind, if you're having a wedding abroad and you invite everybody, that there becomes an element of peer pressure that you have to go. I couldn't be the only family member that didn't go. I mean, this was about 7-8 years ago. But it's quite a difficult one, especially if you then present a wedding list. I don't think they did, actually. But anyway, I've become distracted. Australia is another one where you're having to pay £1,600, so it's 16% more expensive. In Europe, it's about 15% more expensive. In America, again, 15% more expensive. Singapore, about 11%. The Maldives, that's about 10% more expensive than it was this time last year. Japan, not so much, 5%. Actually, if you got married in Turkey, you'd be getting it even cheaper than this time last year. But then this time last year, there was almost a military coup. So I would argue that perhaps that explains the reason why there is probably less demand for weddings in Turkey. So it's an interesting point, but what can you do about it? Because one of the things you have to bear in mind is that obviously you're going to have to choose your destination a little bit more carefully if you want to take into account the value of the pound. And then you're going to have to look at exchange rates and the cost, because you're probably going to have to pay, obviously, the cost of your wedding in the local currency. And the way to do this and probably get the best deal is to use a foreign exchange broker, so somebody whose job is to pay large amounts across into a foreign currency. So you're not going to go down to your local post office and do an exchange rate because you're going to get a terrible deal. There are specialists that do it. You also got to bear in mind that there are quite high transfer fees that banks often apply. So if you're transferring money, they'll also charge a big fee. So if you're paying in instalments for weddings, then you're going to apply quite large fees, some of them, for those regular amounts. You may be better off paying in slightly larger chunks. Now, I'm not going to dictate how people pay their weddings. It's up to them how they do it. Now, you do have a couple of options. I like to be a little bit more solution based than presenting just a problem. Now, how do you find a foreign exchange specialist? If you don't know somebody who can recommend one, then interestingly, Money Supermarket have a comparison of them. So despite them not being particularly mainstream, Money Supermarket, if you go onto their website, they will show you the best way to find the cheapest one. And one thing you might also want to do, if you're paying for a wedding that's a long way in the future, then you can technically fix a rate for money transfer. So you can actually, you're kind of starting to play the currency game there a little bit, and you can actually try and fix the rate of the pound against the foreign currency you're buying your wedding in. Personally, I'm not sure I would do that, only because you're going to kick yourself if the currency suddenly strengthens, and let's say our Brexit negotiations go swimmingly well and the pound suddenly rallies, and especially as we're going to start raising interest rates probably soon, there's a chance that the pound might go up in value. So that is one for the brave. You can start fixing rates. The last point I would make on this, though, is that if you do start doing something like this, then you do need to make sure that the company is regulated and authorised by the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. But ultimately, the moral is get married in this country, in the UK. But, funnily enough, if you're abroad, you should get married in the UK, because you'd get a cracking deal. Because you'll get it about 20% cheaper. That is the moral. So actually, you say that there's been figures to show there's been a massive influx of tourism into the UK because of the fall in the British pound. There is a silver lining to every dark cloud, Andy. Right, on to the next thing.
Yeah, what have we got coming up next?
Right, this is just a final quick warning that people should adhere to. Now, you know that we've got these pension freedoms. There are people out there who are cashing in their pensions left, right and centre, although not technically true, but there are people who are accessing their money, like taking chunks of their pension pot. Now, there was an interesting story that was run in one of the national press papers. I don't think got as much coverage as it should have done And it's one of the things that I loathe about our tax system, and it's the emergency tax code. And I remember the days of when I used to work in Tesco's when I was at sort of 18 to 20, when I used to come back from uni and things like that. And every time I seemed to start work at a new job, whether it was there or whether I then went on to a different job, I used to get hammered for tax every time because I went onto that blasted emergency tax code. It became the bane of my life, and I'd have to then try and get it back. And despite my best intentions to tell the HR people, they seem to always mess it up, and I get hammered for tax. Now, if you don't know what the emergency tax code is, quite simply, in the UK, the taxman, if you start suddenly earning what seemingly a large amount of money that's subject to income tax, or you acquire a large sum of money that's subject to income tax, the taxman suddenly panics and goes, "Oh my God, they should be they're suddenly loaded. We need to tax them more." So there's like an emergency code. They make an assumption that you are going to earn a fortune for the rest of this year, and so that you don't get your full personal allowance applied to a certain amount of money. You get a portion of it. So the reason this is relevant is that what is happening with people who are cashing parts of their pension is that they get hammered for this emergency tax code. So if you are accessing your pension, then quite simply, income tax is applicable. Now, everybody has a personal allowance, don't they, Andy? It's around £11,000 at the moment, but it goes up every year. So what ends up happening was a chap who, quite understandably, he thought, well, do you know what? I haven't really accessed my pension yet. I need to make some, I need to build an extension or a conservatory at the back of my house, and it's going to cost me £10,000. So what he did is he withdrew £10,000 from his pension. He thought, I can take that cash, that tax free. I know it's liable to income tax because pensions are, but because I've not used my personal allowance of any way, I can take that lump sum tax free. That was his logic. It was all to do with also his other circumstances before people write in and go, what about his tax free cash? But he was actually liable to income tax on that bit, like most people would do. But what happened is he suddenly found he got a massive tax bill of about £2,500, and so he didn't have enough money, so he had to dip into his pot again to get even more money out to make up the bill for his conservatory, and suddenly he was getting hammered for 40% tax, and it kind of ended up being this weird, almost vicious circle. He's having to take out more and more of his pension, and he was getting taxed more and more on it because he was having the emergency tax code applied to that amount of money each time, because the taxman effectively looked at it and went, oh my God, this guy's suddenly earning 10 grand a month here, so we need to hammer him as if he's earning £120,000 a year. And what they do is, because he didn't get his whole personal allowance applied against that initial withdrawal, which he should have had. Now, this is because pensions are taxed under your PAYE code. And so what he needed to do is, it's just an unfortunate circumstance. He will get that tax back. And that's the fact. He isn't gone. He will have, the taxman will realise his mistake and go, sorry about that, you can have that tax back, because of course you aren't earning £120,000 a year. But it is an annoyance and a nuisance. So if you are withdrawing your pension and you have got a PAYE and you have got a PAYE code going on, because you will do if you're regularly withdrawing from your pension, then he wouldn't have actually encountered this problem, because what would have happened, it would have been adjusted accordingly. But it seems to be, if you suddenly withdraw a large amount from your pension and you don't have a PAYE code that can be adjusted, or you haven't informed the relevant people for it to be adjusted, then you can get hammered for this emergency tax, and you have to then go through a convoluted process of reclaiming it. And I know, yep, in the long run you get your money back, but what the key takeaway for people is, if you are planning to withdraw from your pension and you think this shouldn't be taxed, then be aware that you may end up having an emergency tax code applied. So to avoid that, you need to speak to your pension provider and talk about what's going on, and so they can advise you how that can be changed, how your PAYE code can be changed if it needs to be, and speak to the taxman. Because what would happen, as in this guy, let's imagine, just like this guy, you need to have £10,000. You could end up paying tax and it'd take a while to get it back. Imagine if you're withdrawing the money for your daughter, your son, who's going to buy a house, and you say, yeah, I'll get the deposit out, and you withdraw it, suddenly you're hammered with tax. You can end up finding you're going to have to take more from your pension than you wanted to, blah, blah, blah. So the moral of the story is to plan ahead and make sure that the emergency tax code isn't applied. If it is, don't panic, you can get the money back. but it just means you're going to end up having to apply for certain forms, which the taxman can advise you. I'm not going to list them all here. And then you're going to end up taking roughly about 30 days once you submit an application to get your tax back for that reclaim to be approved. So, yeah, it's an unfortunate thing of our tax system. It's our tax system basically isn't up to date enough to cope with all these newfound freedoms. But it's not a new thing in a way, because when I was 18, which is over 20 years ago, I was still having problems with emergency tax codes. I can't stand it, but it is to stop people who are going to suddenly earn loads of money and not declare it.
Yeah, I see similar things. I run the payroll for the company that I work for, and whenever individuals get bonuses, the system is quite clever. They use the system now called real-time information, which is plugged into HMRC, and every month it looks at what the employee has earned up to that point. It looks at what it's earning that month, and then it will make assumptions based on this month's earnings, what they'll earn for the rest of the year, and take away the tax-free allowance and then tax accordingly, which is all well and good. But when a big bonus kicks in, what they effectively do is multiply that bonus by 12 and say, okay, that's your new annual salary, and they'll hammer you for the 40% tax that month. The good thing is, because it's PAYE, because it's through payroll, because it plugs in every month, the following month when you don't get that bonus, they make the same calculations. They then look back at what they have taxed you, and then almost immediately pay you back the tax that you've overpaid the previous month. So often I have lots of employees coming up to me saying, hang on a minute, I've been taxed 40% on all of this. This is crazy. I'm not a higher taxpayer. And I just say, yeah, unfortunately, hang on one more month and you'll see it come straight back into your pay. It's not brilliant, but it certainly is better than what we had years ago, which was, you imagine that happening times 12 and then getting a nasty letter from HMRC saying you've underpaid tax, or getting the great letter saying, you've got lots of money coming back to you in the form of a cheque. It's just not very efficient. So this new way is efficient, but not as efficient as it possibly could be.
Do you know what, Andy? That is absolutely brilliant. I completely forgot that that's what you do, and you should have done the whole piece. But Andy explained it fantastically well there. The point that just the proof that it isn't just me saying it, that the PAYE thing does work. And if you have a job, you're employed, or you're already receiving an income from a pension, so you have a PAYE code, then it can be adjusted and you'll get it back the next month. So the system does work, but unfortunately, if you're somebody who isn't in that scenario and you're going to just take in some money, takes a big chunk out of your pension ad hoc, it's the ad hoc element that is the problem. If you're going to just do that, then they can't adjust a PAYE code because you haven't got one, then that will be an issue. So that's a great way to end the podcast, Andy. It's almost like I got a tax expert in or payroll expert to finish it off for me.
I wouldn't quite say that, but working in a company with over 300 employees, I wouldn't say inundated, but I certainly have to refresh myself of the rules every single month as these things crop up. But it's nice really to be able to help people out and explain things, and nearly every time I get someone saying, yeah, I get it now, and then obviously when a bonus crops up again, they kind of know that they've got a little bit of money coming the following month. It's actually quite nice when you get a bonus, you get a bigger amount coming through that month, and then you can almost say, okay, next month I'm going to get a little sweetener too. So,
yeah, but do you know what, Andy? That what you just explained there is why it works. When people's expectations are set in life generally, then they can plan. That's what the sort of key to it all is. With tax, what ends up happening, because the taxman is so faceless, if you ever try to ring the taxman, if you ever try and ring HMRC, you might as well not bother. You might as well be ringing the speaking clock and talking to that, because you don't get anywhere and it takes forever. But just a simple explanation, and you set expectations of how it will work. I think that's one of the problems with a lot of the legislations, whether it's pensions or anything. The headline is very different to what the reality is. And because the logistics, when people, they come up with this headline, this is how it's going to work, and then when actually to put it into practice is very, very different, and the reality is sometimes a little bit more disappointing or a little bit more convoluted than people lead you to believe. So yeah, it's a good one to watch out for anyway. So that is it on this week's podcast, I think, Andy. I think I've covered everything.
You have indeed. So if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's podcast@moneytothemasses.com, or you can get in touch via Twitter, and that is @moneytothemasses with a number 2. Do check out the One Giant Leap podcast as well. There's lots and lots happening over there. Search in your iTunes One Giant Leap. You'll find Damien, and you'll find some amazing podcasts. And there's a Facebook group to go with that, and lots of other information. And actually, Damien, I wanted to say Thank you to the listeners this week. We've had one of our best weeks. We've had a couple of reviews coming in as well. We're feeling the love.
Yeah, we are. And the thing is, I don't read out what people write in very often, but we get lots of people writing in and saying how much they love the podcast and stuff and about what we do. But thank you for your support. Please keep those coming in because they actually help me work out what's going to be on this podcast. And there are a couple of emails I've got that will probably influence what will be on the podcast in 2 weeks' time. That are really helpful because I like to hear what people want me to talk about because every week I have to obviously come up with the ideas. So please do write in, tell us what you do like, what you don't like. It's preferably what you do like, If anything else, any other questions or just general feedback about what's going on at Money to the Masses. I think that's it, Andy. So I will see you in 2 weeks, and I will speak to the listeners in 2 weeks.
Yes, have a lovely break, and good to hear that your house won't be broken into, unless, of course,
don't say that, Andy, because it's almost like you're setting up a challenge for someone to come around my house. But yeah, I will miss my kids for 2 weeks, but I would also like being childless for a couple of days. I know that's not me being unkind. That is just it's quite good once in a while just to be not be dad and mum. I think so. You'll see me in about a week's time.
Good stuff. Enjoy the break, and see you soon.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.